The Cisco Next-Gen Firewall product suite is a somewhat complex offering of software features, hardware models, and some confusing acronyms. This video is an introduction to the Cisco Next-Gen Firewall offering at Rackspace. Some of the software names overlap with hardware names, so it's important that we make a distinction of whether we're talking about hardware or software when referencing Cisco Next-Gen Firewall products. There is a software module that's used as a sidecar to the ASA software in the ASA X 5500 series hardware appliances. That software is called the Firepower module. However, there are also hardware appliances that have been titled Firepower as well. So to avoid confusion as to whether we're talking about the Firepower hardware or the Firepower module used in the ASA platform, we're going to all agree to call the Firepower module used in the ASA platforms the SFR module. You'll see the term SFR used often in Cisco literature, as SourceFire was the company that Cisco acquired that developed the Firepower software used in the module. SFR is an abbreviation for SourceFire. More on this later, but remember, SFR is the Firepower software module loaded on ASA hardware, and we will reserve the word Firepower to refer to the hardware models only so as to avoid confusion between the two. So let's begin with the familiar. The ASA X product line, all of the 5500X series platforms, are capable of running the Cisco Firepower software module, also known as SFR. When we install the ASA operating system on the ASA X firewall appliance hardware, we're actually only using one or two of the many CPU cores on the box, and only half of the RAM available. This is because the bulk of the CPU cores and RAM have been reserved for the SFR module's use. The ASA software and the SFR software run under different kernel spaces and do not share CPU or RAM. All that is required to run the SFR module on the 5508, the 5525, the 5545, and the 5555 ASA hardware platforms is an SSD drive or drives, depending on the model. Note that all of the 5508s purchased by Rackspace have had the SSD drives pre-installed at the factory. All other ASAX models will require an SSD drive or drives, which we do stock in inventory, to be installed by DC Ops. These drives are not hot swappable and do require the unit to be powered off in a maintenance window in order to add the SSD drives and SFR capabilities to an existing ASA installation. You may have noticed that we did not mention the 5585X hardware model. This is because the 5585X with Firepower services went end of sale in August of 2017. It's also worth noting that the 5585 with Firepower services is different than the 5585X and has proprietary hardware modules on board. So a 5585X cannot be converted to a 5585X with Firepower services by simply adding an SSD drive. Again, we can no longer purchase the 5585X with Firepower services hardware. So for that kind of throughput, we're going to need to move to the newer Firepower hardware platforms. In summary, to add Firepower services to an existing installation, on most ASA firewall models, we'll need to go ahead and add an SSD drive or two. The 5508 and the 5585X with Firepower services ship with SSD drives pre-installed. The throughput of a device is one of the key factors to examine when evaluating a device for right size. Note that the following numbers are published by Cisco and are generated under ideal conditions in clear text. If you reduce these published numbers by about 25 to 33%, you'll probably be closer to a real-world throughput number. But again, this is highly variable depending on the class and segment size of traffic and the number of connections per second that may be hitting the box at any one time. As you can see, the published IPS throughput numbers range from 250 megabits per second to 1.25 gigabits per second on the ASA plus SFR platforms. The Firepower hardware is capable of either running the ASA operating system or the Firepower Threat Defense operating system. It's important to know that the concept of an SFR module does not exist on the Firepower hardware, so the ASA code is ASA code only. For next-gen features like IPS, GeoIP policies, etc., we'll need to use the FTD operating system. Firepower Threat Defense is a new operating system that is a combination of the ASA operating system and the SourceFire operating system. This is a unified image that runs under a single kernel. The FTD kernel has access to all CPUs, RAM, and other hardware resources on the appliance. The Firepower 2100 chassis comes in two types, the 2110, the 2120, and then the 2130 and 2140 form factors. Both form factors have 12 10, 100, 1000 RJ45 copper ports. The 2110-2120 chassis has 4 additional SFP ports that support 1 gigabit SFP modules for connections to other media types such as fiber or copper. The 2130-2140 chassis differs here in that the ports are SFP Plus ports, and these ports support 10 gig SFP Plus modules. Additionally, there is an optional network module that can provide additional 10 gig SFP Plus ports. The numbers you see are published by Cisco with the devices running FTD code and represent the simultaneous firewall and IPS throughput numbers combined. These numbers were likely obtained with ideal scenario traffic under the best circumstances. As always, you may want to reduce these by 25 to 33% to get a more realistic idea of the capabilities of the platform. The 4100 series is a significant step up from the 2100 chassis. The supervisor engine is the same one found in the larger 9300 series chassis and offers a more robust set of features like the ability to support clustering of many 4100 chassis to provide a much higher throughput capacity. The supervisor engine and clustering capabilities do not exist on the smaller 2100 series appliance. There are no traffic-facing copper ports on board by default, and these 8 SFP Plus ports support SFP Plus modules for both copper and fiber up to 10 gigabits per second. The optional network modules can support transceivers capable of connecting up to 10 gig and 40 gig Ethernet connections. The Firepower 4100 platform is a much higher capacity chassis capable of up to 10 to 24 gigs in a 1U chassis and much more when clustered. This appliance is aimed at those customers that have a high bandwidth requirement and can run either ASA software with no next-gen features or the unified FTD image with the full suite of next-gen capabilities. The Firepower 9300 series represents a quantum leap above any of the other Firepower platforms. There is only one model, it's a 3U chassis. The 9300 supervisor engine brings us intra and inter-chassis clustering capabilities for both ASA and FTD instances and provides 8 ports for 1 or 10 gig Ethernet SFPs. And it has room for an additional 2 network modules which can bring 10 gig SFP+, 40 gig SFP+, and 100 gig SFP28 support to the platform. The powerhouses of the Firepower 9300 are the hot swappable security modules that are plugged into the unit. Up to 3 of the SM24, SM36, or SM44 blades can be added to a chassis. These blades are the powerhouse for providing a number of ASA and FTD instances, as well as other third-party operating systems like Radware's DDoS protection software. The SM24 brings 24 CPU cores and 256 gigs of RAM to the chassis backplane. Additionally, each module sports 2 800 gig SSD drives. The SM36 brings 36 CPU cores and 256 gigs of RAM to the chassis backplane. And finally, there is the SM44, which brings 44 CPU cores and 256 gigs of RAM to the chassis backplane as well. The 9300 series chassis is the flagship model of the new Firepower hardware line. Depending on the size of the security module loaded into the chassis, we can achieve throughput numbers of 24 gigs to 53 gigs on a single module and up to 133 gigs in a single chassis. This scales by doing intra-chassis clustering between the security modules and then inter-chassis clustering of 9300 appliances, capable of providing over 1 terabit of statefully inspected and IPS monitored throughput. The following datasheets have been provided by Cisco and summarize the throughput on each of the Firepower hardware platforms. There are actually 2 sets of data here. We have provided the first set of datasheets, which give us throughput numbers when running ASA code on the Firepower hardware. Remember, there's no IPS or next-gen capabilities when running ASA code on Firepower hardware. The second set of datasheets represents the throughput when running the unified FTD image, providing the capabilities of the ASA along with IPS inspection and other next-gen features. As always, we may want to reduce these numbers by 25 to 33% to get a real-world idea of the platform's capabilities. While this video's focus is on hardware, I do want to take a brief moment to mention some current limitations of the FTD software which we are required to run for next-gen features on the Firepower hardware that we just finished reviewing. Again, this applies only to FTD software and not to ASA devices running the SFR module. At this time, for remote access VPN and the AnyConnect client, there is no local support for local user authentication on the FTD software platform. This means that in order for a customer to have AnyConnect VPN client access to their environment, they will need to have an LDAP services like Active Directory in their environment in order to have AnyConnect VPN remote access to their hosted networks. Note that Rackspace will be providing an LDAP as a service for VPN user authentication in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. Also, at this time, there is no support for Duo dual-factor authentication on the FTD software platform. However, we expect this functionality on the FTD software platform by the spring of 2019. That's going to wrap up this video. Our next video will focus on the actual next-gen features and capabilities such as IPS, URL inspection, threat intelligence feeds, and GeoIP. See you then.